All right, so today we're diving deep, really deep into the conflict in Ukraine. We've got some fascinating material to work with, both Ukrainian and German media sources. And what we're seeing, I think, is a much more complex picture of this war than you might get from just the headlines. So much going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just about the big battles in the front lines. There's so much happening internally within Ukraine that's really shaping the trajectory of this whole conflict.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to unpack today. We've got this piece from Die Zeit, the German newspaper. The title is, well, it doesn't pull any punches. The AFU is no longer able to hide its weaknesses. Published pretty recently, January 20th, 2025.
Strong words. And coming from Die Zeit, that's significant. They're a highly respected publication in Germany. So this analysis, it's going to have ripple effects. It could really influence how the rest of Europe views this conflict.
I think you're right. And one of the key figures they focus on in this article is Alexander Syrskyy, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian military.
Syrskyy, yeah. His background is really interesting, isn't it?
It is. Tell me more about that.
Well, he was trained in Moscow back in the Soviet era, so his military thinking, it's rooted in that traditional Soviet doctrine. You know, quantity over quality, massive formation.
Yeah, that classic Soviet approach.
Exactly. And the question the article raises is that kind of thinking really effective in the kind of conflict we're seeing today?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have Syrskyy publicly advocating for, asymmetric and non-standard solutions. He's trying to sound modern, adaptable.
Right, like he gets it.
Exactly. But then you look at what's actually happening on the ground, and it's a different story.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, the article gives this example of Syrskyy visiting the front lines near Pokrovsk, promising these game-changing tactics, really trying to boost morale.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But then the front line just keeps creeping closer to the city.
So despite his promises, they're losing ground.
That's what it seems like.
It makes you wonder what's going on there. Is it a failure of strategy, lack of resources, or is there just this disconnect between what the leadership is saying and what the troops can actually do on the battlefield?
Yeah, that disconnect is worrying. And the article really digs into that, It highlights two major scandals within the AFU that have really shaken public confidence and exposed some vulnerabilities potentially linked to Syrskyy's decisions.
Scandals, huh? I'm intrigued. What happened?
Okay, so the first one revolves around the 155th Mechanized Brigade. This is supposed to be their showcase unit, trained and equipped by France, almost €1 billion invested.
Wow, €1 billion. That's a huge investment.
It was. The idea was to create this highly cohesive, effective fighting force. But instead, they took this brigade, broke it up, and disperse the soldiers, many without any combat experience, to different front lines, completely undermining the whole concept.
So they took this elite unit and scattered them to the wind.
Pretty much. And the consequences were devastating. The article says 1,700 soldiers deserted before they even saw combat. That's a third of the entire brigade.
Wow, that's a staggering number. I mean, that speaks volumes about the state of things.
It really does. And this whole fiasco, it triggered a wave of criticism directed at the AFU's command structure. People are pointing to their reliance on these independent brigades, operating without proper support, this fragmented approach.
And they're saying that's what led to the 155th Brigade's collapse.
That's a major part of the criticism, yeah.
It makes sense. If you don't have a cohesive structure, it's hard to function effectively in a high-pressure situation like war.
And the public outcry was so loud after this that Zelensky had to intervene directly. He ordered a halt to the formation of any new brigades and shifted the focus to reinforcing existing ones.
Wow. So even Zelensky had to step in. That's a pretty clear sign that something was seriously wrong.
It was a big deal. And then there's the second scandal. This one came out in Ukrainska Pravda, a Ukrainian newspaper. They reported that the Ukrainian army was pulling personnel from the Air Force, skilled technicians, air defense specialists, and sending them to fight on the ground.
Wait, what? They're taking experts out of the air and putting them in the trenches. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but the article highlights the reported size of the AFU, 880,000 soldiers. If that's accurate, it suggests a serious shortage of infantry. So they're having to pull from other branches, even highly specialized ones.
So basically, they're robbing Peter to pay Paul.
In a way, yeah, and it gets even more complicated because the Air Force issued denials. They said they weren't sending specialists to the front lines.
So what's the truth here?
Well, they did admit that redeploying personnel was necessary due to the difficult situation at the front. So, reading between the lines, it hints at a potential manpower crisis.
I see. So they're trying to downplay it.
Yeah, but the situation is clearly serious. And to make matters worse, Ukrainska Pravda claims that these transfer orders came directly from Syrskyy.
Oh, so now it's all tied back to him.
Exactly, adding fuel to the fire. Zelensky had to step in again. Ordered a stop to the practice. The Air Force launched an investigation, even set up a hotline.
Wow, so this is causing major waves.
It is, and it shows how sensitive the situation is.
Yeah.
And how these scandals are impacting morale and potentially hindering recruitment.
Yeah, if you're thinking about volunteering, seeing these kinds of things play out would definitely give you pause.
Absolutely. It's a lot to absorb. Internal struggles, tactical challenges, and then these scandals on top of it all. It doesn't paint a very optimistic picture.
It really doesn't. And, it's not just anecdotal evidence either. The Die Zeit article goes on to cite Frontelligence Insight, a Ukrainian analytical group that's been quite vocal about these issues.
I've heard of them. They've got a pretty strong reputation, don't they?
They do, and their assessment is sobering, to say the least.
What's their take on all of this?
Their argument is that the AFU is fundamentally hampered by its Soviet legacy, particularly when it comes to its structure. They have this stark quote, "A small Soviet army cannot defeat a large Soviet army."
Wow, that's a pretty scathing critique.
It is. They're basically saying that the AFU is fighting the wrong war with the wrong tools.
It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah, exactly.
So what do they propose? Any solutions?
Well, they agree with Zelensky's decision to stop creating new brigades. They also advocate for appointing officers with recent combat experience and establishing a military ombudsman to protect soldiers' rights.
So a complete overhaul, basically.
That's what they're calling for, yeah. They say the AFU desperately needs structural reform, and they need an independent body separate from the military to make it happen. They stress the urgency, stating that failure to reform could lead to defeat, collapse, instability, disintegration.
Those are some heavy words. Disintegration.
They are, and it really underscores the gravity of the situation.
So even with all the volunteers, the billions in Western aid, Ukraine's fate might come down to its ability to reform itself. It's not just about external support, it's about internal change.
Exactly, and I think that's a key takeaway here. What this deep dive reveals is that external support, while crucial, can only go so far. Internal factors like the will and ability to adapt and reform can be the deciding factors in a conflict like this.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? It's not just about having the most powerful weapons. It's about having the right structures, the right leadership, the ability to learn and adapt in the face of immense pressure.
Absolutely. It's a lesson that applies far beyond Ukraine. It's a reminder that any nation, any military, can be vulnerable to corruption, outdated thinking, human flaws.
Those flaws can have devastating consequences, not just for soldiers on the battlefield, but for entire societies.
Exactly, and that's something we're seeing play out right now in Ukraine. This conflict is a stark reminder of the human cost of war, and the urgent need for solutions that go beyond military might...
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to move on to our next set of sources. We're going to delve into some reporting from the Weekly Mirror to get a better sense of what's happening on the ground in the Donetsk Oblast, where the fighting has been particularly intense.
Yeah, let's see how these internal struggles are playing out on the front lines. I'm really curious to see what the Weekly Mirror has to say.
Me too. It's going to be a fascinating deep dive. So we've been unpacking some pretty heavy reports from Die Zeit and Ukrainska Pravda, revealing those internal struggles, those potential leadership flaws within the AFU. Really makes you think about the bigger picture here.
Yeah, absolutely. Those scandals were truly eye-opening, especially the one with the 155th Brigade. And the redeployment of Air Force personnel, it makes you wonder how all of this is playing out on the ground, in the actual battles happening right now.
You're right. We need to connect those internal challenges with the situation on the front lines. So to do that, let's turn to some reporting from Zerkalo Nedeli, a Ukrainian news source, also known as the Weekly Mirror.
Okay, the Weekly Mirror. What have they got for us?
Well, they've published a couple of articles that focus specifically on battles in the Donetsk Oblast, where the fighting has been particularly intense.
Donetsk, right. That's been a hot spot for a while now.
It has, and one article in particular caught my eye. It's titled, "Russians Break Through to Mines on the Outskirts of Pokrovsk," and it describes how Russian forces have been advancing in that area.
Pokrovsk. That rings a bell.
Remember how Die Zeit mentioned Syrskyy's visits to Pokrovsk, where he promised those innovative tactics?
Yeah, and how, despite his promises, the front line kept getting closer.
Well, the Weekly Mirror is giving us a glimpse of what's happening there.
Okay, so what's the situation? Are the Russians really gaining ground?
According to their reporting, yes. Russian forces have been conducting active assault operations near towns like Udakny and Kotline. Pushing towards those mines on the outskirts of Pokrovsk, they even managed to capture a mine shaft belonging to the Pokrovskoye Coal Company.
So even with Syrskyy's efforts, they're losing ground. It seems like those innovative tactics aren't really turning the tide.
That's what it looks like. And the Weekly Mirror cites the Ukrainian resource Deep State, which uses interactive maps to track the conflict.
I've seen those maps. They're pretty detailed.
They are, and Deep State has been reporting on the Russian advances in the area and how Ukrainian forces are struggling to hold them back.
Is the Weekly Mirror giving any insight into why the Ukrainians are having such a tough time? Are they connecting it back to those internal problems we discussed?
Not explicitly, but they do mention that the Russians are finding success by using small mobile infantry groups rather than relying on heavy equipment.
Interesting. So a more agile approach.
Exactly. And that could play right into the AFU's structural weaknesses. If they're too rigid, too focused on those traditional large-scale formations, they're going to be vulnerable to these smaller, more adaptable Russian units.
Yeah, it's like trying to turn a battleship in a bathtub.
That's a great analogy. And it seems to fit with what the Weekly Mirror is reporting. They highlight another concerning development. In an article titled, "Russians May Break Through the Armed Forces of Ukraine's Defenses on a New Section of the Front. Deep State's Concerns." This time, the focus shifts to the Lyman direction, another hotspot in the conflict.
Lyman, okay, so not just Pokrovsk. They're seeing action in multiple areas.
Exactly, and according to Deep State, the situation around the village of Ivanovka is deteriorating rapidly. Russian forces have gained a foothold there and are continuing to push forward, using the terrain to their advantage and building up their infantry presence.
So it's not just near Pokrovsk. They're making progress on multiple fronts. This is starting to sound very worrying.
It is a worrying trend. Deep State warns that the Russian advance in Ivanovka could have a domino effect, potentially destabilizing Ukrainian defenses along a wider stretch of the front line, from Terny to Yampolivka to Torsk.
And if the Ukrainians are already struggling with manpower shortages and those internal command issues, this could really put them in a precarious position.
Absolutely. It's like they're trying to plug holes in a dam, but the water keeps rising.
Does the Weekly Mirror give any indication of how the Ukrainians are responding to these advances?
They do mention that the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported 64 attacks by the Russians in the Pokrovsk area alone, just in one day.
64 attacks in a single day. That's insane.
It is. So there's clearly heavy fighting going on, but they don't provide specifics about Ukrainian counteroffensives or strategic responses.
So we know they're under immense pressure, but we don't know how they're pushing back.
Right, and that lack of information is concerning, especially considering those internal problems we discussed.
It raises the question, how long can they hold out?
That's the big question looming over all of this. The internal problems are impacting their ability to fight effectively. And as the fighting intensifies, those weaknesses will become more and more apparent. It's a vicious cycle.
Wow, it's been a pretty intense journey so far. We've uncovered these internal standoffs, tactical setbacks, and a real sense of danger on multiple fronts. It all paints a pretty sobering picture of the situation in Ukraine.
It does. It really does. And, all of this brings us to a question that's been hanging over this conflict from the very beginning.
Yeah, the elephant in the room.
Exactly. The question of negotiations. Is there a path to a negotiated peace in this situation? And if so, what would that even look like? It's the question everyone's asking.
Yeah.
Especially considering what we've just learned about the internal struggles within the Ukrainian armed forces. If they're having this much trouble holding their own, even with all the Western support, it makes you wonder what leverage they have in any potential negotiations.
That's the crux of it, isn't it? A weaker position on the battlefield translates into a weaker position at the negotiating table. It's a harsh reality, but it's something we have to acknowledge.
Absolutely. And the longer this conflict drags on, the more difficult it might become for Ukraine to secure favorable terms in any peace agreement. Every day that passes, the risk grows. Further territorial losses, further casualties, further destruction.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes those calls for internal reform within the AFU even more urgent, because even if a ceasefire were declared tomorrow, the underlying problems, the corruption, the outdated command structures, those things aren't going to magically disappear.
No, they won't. Reforming the military isn't just about winning this war. It's about building a future where Ukraine can effectively defend itself, whether it's against Russia or any other potential threat. It's about long-term security and stability.
Exactly, and that long-term stability. It's going to be essential for rebuilding the country, attracting investment, creating a future where Ukrainians can live in peace and security. Without it, the future looks very uncertain.
Absolutely. It's clear that this conflict has layers upon layers, each one more complex than the last. It's easy to get lost in the details, But I think it's important to step back and ask, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What can we learn from this deep dive?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest takeaways is the importance of looking beyond the headlines, beyond the simplistic narratives of good versus evil. Wars are messy, complex, and this one is no exception. There are shades of gray everywhere you look.
There really are. We've seen how internal factors, like leadership decisions and systemic problems, can have a huge impact on the course of a conflict. It's not just about who has more weapons or soldiers. It's about who can adapt, who can overcome their own internal challenges.
And that's a lesson that applies far beyond Ukraine. It's a reminder that any nation, any military, can be vulnerable to corruption, outdated thinking, human flaws. These things exist everywhere, and we have to be aware of them.
We do. And those flaws can have devastating consequences, not just for soldiers on the battlefield, but for entire societies. The human cost of conflict is immense, and it's something we can never forget.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the analysis, the geopolitical implications, all of that. But we can't lose sight of the fact that this war is ultimately about human suffering on a massive scale.
And that's something that should weigh heavily on the minds of everyone involved, from the leaders making decisions to the citizens trying to make sense of it all.
It should. It really should.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. It's a stark reminder of the complexities of war, the human cost, and the urgent need for solutions that go beyond military might.
It has. It's been a challenging but necessary exploration of a conflict that continues to shape our world in profound ways. A conflict that demands our attention, our understanding, and our commitment to seeking a peaceful resolution.
Absolutely. We'll continue to follow the developments in Ukraine, and we'll be back with more deep dives on this and other pressing issues in the future. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged with the world around you. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.